Hello, colleagues. It's a pleasure to participate in this session and present what Portugal has achieved so far and what is planned for 2030 and beyond. My name is Paulo Lourenço, and I am the head of the Mitigation Policies Unit within the Climate Change Department of the Portuguese Environment Agency. Starting with the national GHG emissions trend. Following a rapid growth during the 90s, national emissions experienced a slowdown in the early 2000s, with a significant decline after 2005. These trends reflect the evolution of the Portuguese economy, which experienced strong growth in the 90s, driven by increased energy demand and mobility. From 2005, emissions began to decrease due to cleaner fuels, more cogeneration units, the growth of renewable energy sources, mainly wind and hydropower, and energy efficiency measures. The upward trend seen from 2014 to 2017 was reversed mainly due to the increase of renewable energy in primary energy consumption and a significant reduction in coal used for electricity generation, which ended definitely in 2021 with the closure of the country's coal-fired power plants, an historic milestone in Portugal's climate efforts. According to the latest data, GHG emissions, excluding land use change, and forestry, were estimated at approximately 56.4 megatons of CO2 equivalent, representing a 4.4% reduction compared to 1990 levels, and a 34.8% compared to 2005. As illustrated in this figure, the energy sector, including transportation, has consistently been the largest source of national GHG emissions over the years, representing about 67% of total emissions in 2022. Within the energy sector, energy production and transportation are the most significant emission sources, accounting for approximately 50% and 30% of total national emissions, respectively. Estimates for the land use and forestry sector show a transition from a net emitter in 1990 to a CO2 sink in 1991. However, this situation was reversed in 2003, 2005, and 2017 due to severe forest fires, particularly exacerbated by the extreme weather conditions in 2017. And despite these challenges, efforts are underway to address them through a variety of adaptation and mitigation measures. If we look at GHG emissions per unit of GDP, it reveals two distinct periods. Until 2005, there was a clear link between GDP growth and emissions increase. However, from 2005 onwards, there was a decoupling between these indicators, leading to a reduction of the carbon intensity of emissions in 2022 of about 40% compared to 2005. It is essential to highlight Portugal's trajectory in energy and climate policy in recent years. The country has successfully decoupled its GDP from CO2 emissions and primary energy consumption, a trend that has persisted into 2022. This shows that Portugal can generate economic growth while simultaneously reduce emissions and energy use, which benefits both the economy and society. Renewable energy sources are playing an increasingly important role in national electricity production. By the end of 2022, we have reached 17.4 terawatts of installed capacity, which is approximately 80% higher than in 2010 and continues to grow significantly every year. In this context, in 2022, the share of renewables in electricity production was 56%, and given the strong focus and growth in Portugal energy transition, we can also share that in 2023, this number has increased to almost 71%, having surpassed 80% in the first half of 2024. Despite the predominance of hydropower and wind energy in Portugal, solar energy has been the fastest growing sector and has attracted significant investment. It is now the third largest electricity generation source in terms of installed capacity, only behind hydropower and wind, and has surpassed natural gas in this regard. Portugal, as a member state of the EU, is included in the EU quantified economy-wide unconditional joint emission reduction target for 2020 under the Convention, which represents a 20% reduction of total GHG emissions in the EU compared with the 1990 levels. Important to stress that there's no individual target for Portugal in this context, since this is a joint collective target of the EU. The EU target has been implemented and overachieved through the 2020 Climate and Energy Package that covered the period from 2013 to 2020, which outlined the reduction responsibilities between the EU emissions trading system and the effort-sharing decision. The EU ETS aimed for a 20% reduction compared to 2005, while the effort-sharing decision sectors, also called non-ETS sectors, had a 10% reduction target, and both were successfully exceeded at EU level. Regarding Portugal non-ETS 2020 targets, while the EU ETS operates on a collective level, the non-ETS or effort-sharing decision target was divided among member states, focusing on emissions from sectors like transport, buildings, agriculture, and waste. Portugal committed to limiting GHG emissions from these sectors to a +1% increase from 2005 levels between 2013 and 2020. And by meeting all annual targets, Portugal achieved a 21% reduction by 2020 compared to 2005 emissions. Notably, the EU ETS sector in Portugal achieved a 50% reduction in 2020, also compared to 2005 levels, showcasing its cost effectiveness. In 2021, a new cycle started, focused on the EU collective net emission reduction target, which has been revised to support the 55% GHG emission reduction goal. As a result, specific targets for the ETS and non-ETS sectors have also been updated, with a 62% and 40% reduction respectively compared to 2005 levels. Consequently, Portugal is now committed to reducing emissions from non-ETS sectors by 28.7% between 2021 and 2030, up from the previously established target of 17%. It is also important to note that, as part of the 2023 revisions of the ETS directive, a new emissions trading system named ETS2 was established. This system will address CO2 emissions from fuel combustion in buildings, road transport, and other sectors, complementing existing policies and helping member states in achieving their emission reduction targets under the effort-sharing regulation. Additionally, it would be also important to mention that a new target for removals by natural sinks of 310 million tons of CO2 equivalent by 2030 has been established under this major EU legislative recent update to support the climate neutrality goal. Portugal has established a strong legal and regulatory framework for climate change, drawing from experience since the early 2000s. Initial steps included the 2004 National Programme for Climate Change, the pioneering National Strategy for Adaptation to Climate Change, and the innovative Portuguese Carbon Fund, now the Environment Fund, supporting climate projects. Driven by political commitment to transitioning towards a competitive, resilient, carbon neutral, and circular economy, Portugal pioneered in committing to carbon neutrality by 2050. And in response to this commitment, adopted in 2016 the Carbon Neutrality Roadmap, representing Portugal's long-term strategy submitted to the UNFCCC in 2019. Aligned with this long-term strategy, Portugal also developed an integrated national energy and climate plan, which represents the main energy and climate policy instrument for this decade. More recently, the publication of the National Climate Law in 2021 has brought a new level of governance in terms of climate policy. an innovative instrument that consolidates objectives, principles, and obligations for the different levels of governance for climate action, establishing new provisions in terms of climate policy, namely rights and duties in climate matters, recognizing the climate emergency situation, and strengthening the right to citizen participation in the involvement of local actors. The national climate law has raised considerably the scope of national climate policies, setting out ambitious objectives. Key provisions include mandatory municipal and regional climate action plans, sectorial mitigation and adaptation plans, a green industrial strategy, parliamentary oversight of progress, and sustainable finance considerations. And in addition, it also reinforced the commitment to achieve climate neutrality by 2050, exploring the anticipation of this goal to 2045 and setting more ambitious GHG emission reduction and removal goals. Since the approval of the National Energy and Climate Plan 2030 and the Carbon Neutrality Roadmap, significant developments have occurred, leading to major changes in energy and climate policies. The Fit for 55 package that intended to revise and update the EU legislation and to put in place new initiatives with the aim of ensuring that EU policies are in line with the climate goals, the recent energy crisis, alongside with important technological improvements and new goals that have been set by the national climate law, led to the revision of both the short and long-term climate strategies, a process that, although not yet complete, is already in its final stages. Ensuring coherence between Portugal energy and climate policies and in alignment with the carbon neutrality roadmap, Portugal is setting ambitious 2030 goals to support the EU goal of becoming the first climate neutral bloc by 2050. Aiming for a 55% reduction in GHG emissions in 2030, as mandated by the national climate law, the most recent modeling exercise suggests that a 57% reduction from 2005 levels is possible by 2030, with, of course, appropriate measures. All sectors must contribute, although their reduction potential varies depending on the maturity of technologies and cost effectiveness, and in this decade, electricity production, transport, and buildings are expected to lead decarbonization efforts. These goals presented in this slide were established at national level in order to meet the effort-sharing regulation target under the EU. And that's why there is no specific goal for industry or electricity production, for example, since they are already covered by collective effort under the EU ETS. The emissions registered in 2020 confirm that most sectors are on track to meet their national sectoral goals, except for the agricultural sector, indicating a need for enhanced policies and measures to correct the trajectory and ensure compliance with the 2030 goal. However, and given the recent developments and the ambitious goal ahead, we are also working on the challenges posed by the transport sector. To conclude, I would like to share some final messages outlining Portugal's past and future efforts. Portugal surpassed its 2020 EU climate goal, demonstrating an ongoing commitment to ambitious climate action in line with the EU objectives and reflecting our contribution to achieving the objectives of the Paris Agreement. Portugal remains committed to supporting other parties, particularly the most vulnerable, in their climate transition by exploring innovative solutions such as the debt swap into climate action measures. The country has maintained a consistent emission reduction trajectory aligned with both short and long-term goals, recognizing challenges within specific sectors. With a robust policy framework, Portugal became one of the first countries worldwide to commit to carbon neutrality by 2050. And the updated climate and energy framework reflects intensified cross-sector commitment with new policies and measures. Our 2030 goals are ambitious yet achievable, underscoring the urgency of economic decarbonization within this decade. Portugal shows strong dedication to bolstering renewable energy by increasing electrification and establishing a renewable fuel-based system, including renewable gases like hydrogen and biomethane. Portugal demonstrated its ambition early on as the fourth European country to end coal-fired electricity production, closing its coal plants in 2021, exceeding initial commitments and consolidating the transition away from fossil fuels. We aim to double the installed electricity production capacity by 2030, achieving 93% renewable incorporation in electricity production by that time, thereby supporting accelerated decarbonization, diversification of energy sources, meeting the needs of new green industrial investments, and promoting the elimination of natural gas by 2040, as foreseen in the National Climate Law. The goal for climate neutrality has now been anticipated to 2045, and this effort will also be reflected in the respective policies and measures aiming to ensure that the necessary conditions are in place for this to happen, including in the context of a just transition with special focus on the most vulnerable groups. Thank you very much for your attention.